On February 1st, 2010, the roadway connecting Singapore to southern Malaysia was jammed with cars and trucks. While it's usually a hotbed for traffic, this day was particularly bad. The cause? 37 trucks on the Malaysian side were left abandoned after their drivers inexplicably just walked away. Customs were only a few yards from the trucks, and upon investigation, they found these trucks were filled with contraband most people wouldn't think of as dangerous or linked to crime. No, Customs didn't find drugs or undocumented migrants or diamonds. They found sand. Yes, the stuff that gets all over your car floor after a day at the beach. The same sand that you used to build castles and trenches with and dig holes as a kid. You know, it's coarse and grainy and gets everywhere. But how did sand become a fundamental factor of power in Southeast Asia, and specifically in Singapore? The short answer is because it's a valuable commodity for construction. But in this video, we'll examine how one country's economic survival became so reliant on a multi-billion-dollar trade in imported sand, as well as the black market this need created, all run by corrupt sand mafias. It's a story about a nation's insatiable appetite for expansion and the consequences that came along with it. Before we get digging into the sand mafia, let's start at the beginning with Singapore. But before we start with Singapore, let me start by saying hello everybody and welcome to the story of the Singapore Sand Mafia. This is a crime ring that I guarantee most people in the Western world have never heard of or never even thought could happen. But anywhere in the world that something's valuable, getting your hands on it illegitimately will be a valuable business. So we're going to talk about why sand became so important, why there's a crime ring around it, and a lot of the stories involving that. So if international smuggling sounds fun to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the sand mafia. But you know what's another resource that there's only a limited supply of? That's right, your health. Taking care of yourself is even easier thanks to today's sponsor, AG1. AG1 is your one-stop shop for many of your body support needs like multivitamins, multiminerals, pre and probiotics, so you can make taking care of yourself easier than ever. And by easy, I really do mean easy, because all you need is 8 to 12 ounces of water and a spoonful of AG1 and you're good to go. And supporting things like the health of your immune system, your gut, and your brain is certainly something you don't want to skip out on. AG1's been a huge help to me because I'm sure like many of you that watch YouTube a lot, no offense, as someone that makes YouTube videos, my diet is not what it should be. Cold pizza and noodles can only get you so far, but AG1 has helped me do things like be more regular and not be as tired throughout the day. And it's not like AG1's some super cure or miracle drug, it's just putting the things into your body that your body's been missing out on. So you can start closing your nutrient gaps and opening up space in your cabinet starting today, because AG1's here with an exclusive offer. That's because if you head to the link in the description at drinkag1.com/Wendigang, along with your order, you'll get an AG1 flavor sampler that includes things like their citrus, tropical, and berry flavors, as well as a bottle of vitamin D3 and K2, and their welcome kit that includes things like a shaker bottle and a metal canister to store your AG1 in. So to get in on this $72 of included value, head to the link in the description at drinkag1.com/Wendigang to get yours today. Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So, like I said before, let's start with Singapore. This small, prosperous island country is composed of one main island and 63 satellite islands and inlets, making it one of the 20 smallest states in the world. Like most small Asian territories, Singapore has a history of being controlled by foreign powers. In the early 1800s, the British Empire established Singapore as a trading post, and in 1867, it was officially under direct British control. During World War II, Singapore was controlled by Japan for a short period before returning to Britain in 1945. Then, in 1963, the country was briefly part of Malaysia's new federation, but after 2 years, racial tensions and economic disputes between the two parties led to Singapore's independence as a sovereign country. Since it split from Malaysia in 1965, Singapore has become one of the world's wealthiest countries, known for its spotless streets, highly maintained parks, and unmatched living standards in Southeast Asia. The 1980s saw a massive economic boom in Singapore, specifically in the services industry. The country has also become renowned for its ability to process silicon for microchips and electronics, but it's chiefly prized for its regional position within Asia. Singapore has become the continent's premier business, financial, and shipping hub, a place that connects industrial leaders and business executives in the Pacific. In May of 2010, Global Witness, an international organization that investigates environmental and human rights abuses, released a report stating that Singapore's GDP per capita was $50,000, which made it among the richest nations in the world. This stat is notable because, in terms of land mass, Singapore is extremely poor. To put it in a context, Singapore is 3.5 times the size of Washington, D.C. That's right, only 3.5 DCs, but with nearly 8 times as many inhabitants. With a population of over 6 million people, the country today needs to expand its size to accommodate housing and industrial growth. You might assume that the need for more size within a tiny footprint would require building vertically, but in fact, Singapore today is largely flat. Throughout the 60s, the country leveled its hills for land reclamation, which is the process of creating new land from oceans, seas, or rivers and lake beds. One of the key resources needed in land reclamation is sand. After Singapore exhausted all of its soil and dirt from its own hills for expansion, the country eventually switched to importing sand from other countries. And with that information, you can probably see where this is going. Since the 1960s, Singapore has increased its land area horizontally by an astonishing 24%, from 581.5 square kilometers to 732.2 square kilometers. That's incredible when you think about it. Imagine any country adding a quarter of its size to its own. According to its government, Singapore will increase its land area by an additional 100 square kilometers by 2033. This means that, in a little less than a decade, the island will be a full 30% larger than its original size. And sand is the key to all of it. Sand is the second most extracted material in the world behind water. And even if you don't live near a beach, you're likely surrounded by it. Office buildings, sidewalks, bridges, and shopping malls are made with concrete, which is made by sand and gravel mixed together with cement. Not only is sand essential for brick, asphalt, and concrete, but it's also used in products ranging from toothpaste to computer chips. That's right. Ever wonder what that minty feeling on your teeth is after you get done brushing your teeth? You're welcome. Suffice to say, sand is one of the most consumed resources on the planet, with some people calling its high demand the new gold rush, or at least, global news called it that, which is some people. Others call it the currency of development. It's an overlooked ingredient that makes modern life possible, but we don't recognize it because, unlike water, we don't buy it as individuals. Even though if you're in a building or on a road right now, you're benefiting from sand, unless you're building a sandbox for your kids, you probably don't think about getting it. But getting it goes a long way for all of us. And unfortunately, we're starting to run out. The process of erosion that creates sand takes thousands of years, and we're currently mining it at a rate faster than its renewal. China and India, both of which rely on their own national supply, are consuming the resource at alarming levels. Just to put China's economic growth and demand for sand, or sand demand, into perspective, from 2011 to 2013, the country used, quote, more cement than the United States used in the entire 20th century. That is an absolutely staggering statistic. Think about, from 1900 to 1999, how much cement was used in the United States, and realize that China used more than that in 3 years. While sand mining is mostly associated with developing countries whose need for expansion outweighs environmental consequences, the United States is an exception. In 2020, one of America's last beach mines closed in Monterey, California, when scientists discovered that the mining company had, quote, taken so much sand off the shoreline that it caused significant erosion nearby. In fact, the physical wear was so damaging that a former World War II era officers club was demolished because it was about to crash into the sea from its deteriorating cliff. In Houston, Texas, efforts are being made to stop a sand mine on the banks of the San Jacinto River, as it's alleged to have caused sedimentation, a process which affects water quality and can contribute to flooding. When Hurricane Harvey struck the Houston area in 2017, sediment blocked and backed up drainage ditches as floodwaters pushed them downstream. Essentially, these sand mines exacerbated flooding along the San Jacinto River in ways that didn't occur in other areas of Houston. But despite the bans, illegal sand mining still occurs in the United States and elsewhere. You might be asking yourself, why not just use sand from somewhere like the Sahara Desert. Well, aside from logistical and ecological issues, desert sand grains are too round from wind erosion to be able to stick together for construction purposes. Angular grains, which are from sand found in rivers and oceans, interlock and hold concrete together. So, other than the fact that it's really far away and would be really expensive to harvest and move, we can't use it once it gets here. As for Singapore's land reclamation projects, 3.75 million cubic meters of sand are needed to reclaim 1 square kilometer of land from the sea. That's the equivalent of 3.5 Empire State Buildings filled with sand just for 1 square kilometer. I mean, you've been to the beach, you've dumped a handful of sand in the water, it didn't immediately become permanent land. Think of how many handfuls you'd need for it to become permanent land. Singapore uses both sea and river sand. Sea sand is dumped into the ocean as a filler, while river sand, which has a finer grain, is used for concrete. With so much expansion, it's no surprise that Singapore ran out of its own sand supply decades ago. This is what fueled the massive sand trade industry. In 2008, according to the country's own figures, which is a crucial detail we'll talk about later, Singapore imported more than $273 million worth of sand. And while that sounds like a lot, that's according to the country's own figures. These numbers only account for the legal trade. For a country renowned for its by-the-book policies, like harsh penalties for littering or chewing gum, highly efficient governance, and its rule of law, it came as a shock to the world to find out that, as Singapore entered the 2010s, numerous illegal sand excavations were actually traced to Singaporean companies. When it came out that these companies were responsible for illegal excavation, it led to a lot of questions. How much did officials truly know about these imports? Or did they collude with these companies themselves, knowing how lucrative this enterprise could be? But most importantly, where did Singapore sand even come from? Well, the first place you ask to borrow a cup of sugar from is your neighbor, right? And Singapore's neighbor, Malaysia, was the first place to look for sand. Malaysia was the main supplier of Singapore's imported sand until 1997, when the then Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad imposed a sand export ban from Malaysia to Singapore. Unfortunately, the ban was minimally effective and, for most of the 2000s, a complete illusion. To prove this, just take the official figures from the United Nations Comtrade database. Given that the trade was illegal, this database has the best approximation available. With both countries reporting to the United Nations in 2008, Singapore declared 3 million tons of sand were imported from Malaysia, while Malaysia declared 133 million tons of sand were exported to Singapore. So, slight discrepancy. Malaysia said 133 million tons left, and Singapore said they only found 3. So I guess 130 million tons got lost driving over the border. And yes, this was 10 years after the export ban had been put into effect. So clearly, someone had something to hide. Corruption and a lack of oversight from the Malaysian government gave rise to what came to be known as the Sand Mafia. Illegal sand mining and smuggling networks across Southeast Asia. The term mafia is used in this context to reflect the fact that this is an organized crime ring abetted by corruption. However, isolated petty smuggling does occur on various beaches, particularly in Africa. In other parts of the world, sand mafia has even more definitions. For example, in India, media reports use sand mafia as a term to describe anyone, quote, threatening journalists, NGO workers, government officials, and community leaders who oppose illicit extraction of sand from a given location. So in India, you'll hear sand mafia used as a term to describe someone who is threatening those who are trying to slow down or stop the sand trade. In June of 2010, a Malaysian newspaper, The Star, investigated a Malaysian dredging company based on the Johor River. This is about 50 miles away from the Singapore Strait. The company claimed it was shipping extracted sand within Malaysia, which is how it got its transport license. The company's destination was from the Johor River to the major port at Tanjung Palay Pass, or simply PTP. The shortest route, conveniently, was through Singaporean waters. The company's barges sailed down the Malaysian-Singapore border, where they passed through customs, but they never made it to their final destination, PTP. Instead, they stopped at a Singaporean jetty where they unloaded their cargo using forged paperwork. The Star had estimated this route had been in use since 2007, and nearly 3 million cubic meters of river sand had netted the Sand Mafia a profit of about $77.8 million. I mean, the amount of sand they're moving is obviously large. It's not like you could smuggle it in under your jacket. But if you have fake cargo papers, you can just sail down to Singapore and then pass it off to another boat. That same year, 34 people were arrested for a sex for sand scandal, in which Malaysian officials and businessmen were accused of accepting bribes of cash and sexual favors from sex workers in exchange for dredging permits to authorize sand exports to Singapore. So, seducing Malaysian officials to get more sand into Singapore. What a time to be alive. Singapore's response was basically restating its policy on imported sand. All suppliers were required to show a license to dredge sand at specific locations in the source countries, show survey reports, and a bill of loading. In turn, the Singaporean government would verify that the supplier's documentation was accurate. But this system was and is based on the assumption that the paperwork is honest and legitimate, and more importantly, that the officials are reliable and trustworthy. Without those, these documents are merely pieces of paper. With corruption running rampant in Malaysia, this is often the case. I mean, Singapore is getting grilled for all of the illegal sand that's coming into their country that they're benefiting off of, and their response is the same as a bouncer's in front of a bar who says he just needs to see an ID, so you can just wave by like a piece of toast, and he's like, all right, get on in there. Despite Malaysia's black market supply for exporting sand, Singapore's demand for it meant more than one country needed to serve as a supplier. So enter a second exporter, Indonesia. Indonesia's archipelago consists of more than 17,000 islands. Those nearest to Singapore are only a few miles away. Many of these islands within Singapore's reach are practically uninhabited, which Singapore has taken advantage of. Its dredging has wiped some of them completely off the map, like Nipah Island, which is located on the border between Singapore and Indonesia. In 2003, a local NGO, or non-governmental organization, reported that Nipah had completely disappeared. Quote, with only 3 to 4 palm trees visible to mark the island's location. The government had to go back and fill Nipah to save it, as it's an important factor in determining Indonesia's maritime border with Singapore. Sand dredging in Indonesia for export started in 1979, when 3 companies were permitted to mine sand, and by 2001, more than 300 companies were operating in waters off Indonesia's Riau province. That same year, a report from Down to Earth detailed that the illegal sand mining was, quote, allegedly controlled by a cartel of 3 Singaporean-backed companies supplementing the legal operations to supply sand to Singapore. People were so mad about this that later that year, a group of enraged locals took over a sand dredging ship in the Durian Strait. When a crew member opened fire, the villagers dispersed, but a 36-year-old man was killed in the process. Indonesia's numbers show that from 1997 to 2001, the country exported more than 150 million tons of sand to Singapore. But like all official reports, it doesn't take into account illegal exporting on the black market. If there's an amount of sand that can be legally dredged and sold that year, they'll just hit that number and then conveniently find more somewhere else, nudge nudge. It's more likely to be double what's officially documented. In 2007, the Indonesian parliament banned the export of sea sand, which, like Malaysia's ban, was ignored by even the Indonesian government. One of the loopholes smugglers used was relabeling the sea sand as coastal or land sand to reclassify their cargo. In the government's defense, imagine being that customs agent who inspects the cargo and sees sand that is labeled coastal sand, and then being like, no. This is clearly sea sand. I can tell by the way that it is. And if you're wondering if anyone is noticing all this sand going missing, they have, because the effects have been devastating. From 2005 to 2010, 24 more islands were believed to have disappeared as a result of sand extraction. Without regulations, these unguarded coasts are sitting ducks. There are plenty of beaches to choose from, remote enough that anyone can park loud dredging equipment, work throughout the evening unbothered, go back to Singapore in a few short hours, and, using forged paperwork, sell their sand. Seems like there's a pattern. After a ban is imposed in one country, another country ramps up sand dredging. Which brings us to Cambodia. Every month in Cambodia's Kakong province, nearly 900,000 tons of sand is dredged. In one calendar year, the total amount of sand from that province is worth, quote, $250 million on the Singaporean market, according to Time magazine. However, according to a Cambodian government-sponsored website, only 40,000 to 60,000 tons of sand are extracted every month in Kakong. So, again, we have a pattern. Cambodia says that it's 40 to 60,000 tons, while when Time looked at it, it's about 900,000. That's every month. A damning report from Global Witness targeted Cambodia for its sand dredging practices and fraudulent accounting, stating that two Cambodian senators in particular, both of whom are close to Cambodia's prime minister, were key figures at the center of the country's sand smuggling. The report shed light on the devastating effects of the river dredging in the country, and how a small group of elites controlled the public and private sectors that sanctioned sand mining projects. After its publication, the report was denounced by both the Singaporean and Cambodian governments, but the damage to the local ecology is hard to ignore. When dredging sucks up sand, it increases something called turbidity, which measures water clarity by how suspended particles such as silt, clay, or microbes scatter light. In other words, it's a valuable tool to measure water quality. High turbidity, even when only temporary, can suffocate coral reefs, disrupting fish spawning and destroying populations. In Cambodia, the overdredged waterways lower the river stream floors and interfere with natural sedimentary processes. Basically, to keep exporting sand to Singapore, Cambodia had to kill its rivers and destroy its rich marine life. Today, Kampot, a region that houses seagrass beds that provide shelter to dugongs, green turtles, Irrawaddy dolphins, and hairy-nosed otters, which is one of the world's rarest mammals, is at risk of being completely wiped out due to dredging. When Paul Ferber, the director of Marine Conservation Cambodia, dove into the Srei Ombel River after ships had dredged the area, he was shocked to discover that in the 15 kilometers of river he traveled, quote, he saw exactly one fish and two shrimp. Even dredging at only 10 meters causes irreparable harm, killing off mangroves that provide a necessary ecosystem for fish to survive. And for local Cambodian fishermen who rely on these areas to provide for their families, they must find another way to survive. Local Cambodians were upset, as you can imagine. In February of 2010, they took matters into their own hands when the unanswered letters they sent to the Prime Minister proved pointless. After attempting to pressure their local provincial leaders, the angry residents had no choice. They destroyed the nearby dredging equipment after a collapsing riverbank threatened their village. ABC News reported that a Cambodian real estate tycoon and politician, Lee Yong Fat, was responsible for organizing dredging operations at 3 local estuaries. As of 2024, he serves as a senator, quote, with the ruling Cambodian People's Party and a member of the party's Central Committee. And once again, the cycle continues. When people in a country get upset because their country is selling a lot of sand to Singapore, because that's their sand, another country shows up next on the chopping block. Just a few hundred kilometers northwest of Cambodia, another country faces similar problems, all just to satiate Singapore's hunger for sand: Vietnam. Vietnam's sand mining, for the most part, is completely unregulated. Despite the country's officials' public statements calling for an end to the prohibited practice, in 2013, quote, 3 local government officials were charged with taking bribes in exchange for ignoring illegal sand mining on the Tian River. In fact, in 2016 alone, authorities caught nearly 3,000 people who were dredging without permits or in protected areas, which includes the Mekong Delta, keystone to the country's economic stability. Think about that. 3,000 people caught for the sand trade in 1 year in one country. When sand on the Mekong gets depleted, the low water levels threaten agriculture by reducing nutrient-dense sediment for soil. Fish habitats are also destroyed by sand mining, as well as local infrastructure due to erosion. Like most black market and criminal enterprises, many of these miners are regular people without better options to try to make a living, so they're willing to do whatever it takes. That desperation creates an environment ripe for tension. For example, in the spring of 2017, a countrywide crackdown caused a group of illegal sand miners to dump sand on a police boat in an attempt to sink it, which I do have to admit is kind of funny and creative, if you know. Also, I think directly from a Bugs Bunny cartoon. In addition to similar environmental impacts that affect Cambodia, Indonesia, and Malaysia, tensions between local Vietnamese fishers and sand miners have escalated. In June of 2017, a fight broke out between villagers and miners that put 2 people in the hospital. As we've seen, sand smuggling is a lawless business under the guise of useless bans and media propaganda. But how far are these sand mafias willing to go? Unfortunately, for opposing parties who stand up to mining operations, they risk violence, bloodshed, and even murder. That doesn't appear to be going away anytime soon. As the value of sand skyrockets, these mafias take increasingly drastic measures to ensure the success of their smuggling. And nowhere are these groups more violent or deadly than those operating in Africa and India. In 2016, a BBC correspondent researching beach erosion in Jamaica was shocked to learn from locals that nearby mafias of armed men would fight each other for smuggling dominance, much like street gangs or the Italian mob. The winning gang would haul away bags of sand in the middle of the night, where they sold them to construction crews of beachfront development sites. In 2017, 2 Kenyan truck drivers were burned beyond recognition when a gang of locals attacked them as they were loading their vehicles at a nearby river. In Kenya's Makwani County, sand miners and locals battled for several years with, quote, bows and arrows, machete-like pangas, and Molotov cocktails. In China, dozens of rival sand gang members were imprisoned after a massive knife battle took place in front of a police station. Is that not just such a crazy phrase? Rival sand gang members got into a knife battle? In Indonesia, 2 farmers led protest against illegal sand dredging operations, and in response, the mine operators threatened to kill the farmers if they kept protesting. The farmers reported the threats to the police and asked for protection, but soon met a grisly end. One of the farmers was attacked by several men, run over by a motorcycle, and left for dead. The other farmer was beaten and stabbed to death. His body left out in the street with his hands tied behind his back. In India, hundreds have been injured and dozens killed by sand mafias. Victims include an 81-year-old teacher and a 22-year-old activist who, quote, were separately hacked to death, a journalist who was burned to death, and at least 3 police officers who were run over by sand trucks. In 2018, Sandeep Sharma, a reporter with a local television station in India, was run over by a sand truck after he filmed a police officer accepting a bribe to keep quiet on a sand mining operation in a crocodile sanctuary. He survived, but when Sharma asked for protection from the authorities, he was denied and forced to hand over the original recording to the police. Another victim, this time a special branch constable named Tamal Nadu, was murdered for collecting intelligence at an illegal sand mining site. In 2012, French documentarian Sophie Bontemps and her crew were arrested for filming a sand mining operation in the dunes of Morocco. Sophie was interrogated and her equipment was confiscated by authorities. Later that evening, a military colonel and 2 other officials arranged a mock trial in a hotel where the crew members were forced to erase their footage. It was clear to the director that everyone, from local workers to national officials, were not only involved in sand trafficking, but profiting from it. In her film, Morocco, Raiding on the Sand, in which the erased footage was restored from off-site backups the filmmakers had made, local protesters were beaten and threatened. In June of 2019, Jose Luis Alvarez Flores, a Mexican environmental activist who protested illegal sand mining in a local river, was shot dead. When he was discovered, a note was also found that threatened Flores' family and other activists. The illegal sand trade has become extremely profitable in a short time, not just for those participating in the trade, but for the politicians protecting the operations. As a matter of fact, I'm sure it's even more so beneficial for them. And like any high-demand industry prohibited by the government, the result is a robust black market that moves geopolitics as much as it does money. After all, land is often one of the most influential and important assets to a global power. So what happens when one of the players can simply make more land? For a moment, let's consider a larger, more powerful nation, China. Builders in the country call sand soft gold, the trade of which skyrocketed in the 1980s during Shanghai's construction boom. China dredged its sand from the Yangtze River because it was the ideal for mixing into cement. By 2000, sand extraction had gotten so extreme that long stretches of the riverbank collapsed. Same year, authorities banned sand mining on the Yangtze altogether, but the trade continued illegally. During the day, these ships look innocent enough, but at night, they would, quote, lower pipes to the riverbed to suck up thousands of tons of sand in a single session. In 2019, police seized over 300 sand dredging ships and enough sand to fill over 1,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. A few years earlier, in the mid-2010s, when China was in full operation of its island enhancement program, the leaders of the other Southeast Asian nations came together to raise international concern over the country's Great Wall of Sand in a vital area, the Spratly Islands. Located in the southern area of the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands are claimed by several nations: China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. The islands consist of over 100 islets and reefs spread over 240,000 kilometers of ocean. Most vitally, the value this region has for maritime trade is enormous, specifically for Australia, as over 50% of Australian trade passes through the South China Sea with, quote, $5 trillion in trade overall flowing through the region. These shipping sea lanes are not only important for trade in the region, but for food security as well. Around 10% of the world's fishing catch or harvest takes place in the South China Sea. China was originally left with smaller pieces of the Spratly Islands because it came late to the island occupation game. But through the sand trade, the country has been building and expanding these tiny pieces of land. The island building is, quote, an attractive option to add substance, literally, to China's physical presence among the disputed islands of the South China Sea. But it isn't just China. Singapore, which I'll remind you is the world's largest importer of sand, has seen similar geopolitical ramifications come from the sand trade. Since most of Singapore's reclaimed land sits on parts of the ocean that once belonged to the Singapore Straits, separating it from Indonesia, the expansion demands new maritime boundaries every time new land is reclaimed. The consequences go beyond new lines drawn on a map or loss of livelihoods due to the disappearance of fishing grounds. The erasure of these islands changes the entire seabed's natural defense against floods and tidal waves. Residents who once lived in the coastal communities on Ubi Besar Island in Thousand Islands, Jakarta, were forced to move after the island submerged underwater. As for Singapore's next-door neighbor, Malaysia, every time Singapore's soil creeps into their waters, the country demands a reapportionment of territory and sea trade lanes between the two nations. But unlike the Spratly Islands dispute, which is regulated under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Malaysia's is not. Singapore can legally reclaim sovereignty around existing islands, reefs, and archipelagos. So Malaysia's demands to the newly exported territory holds no water, or holds no sand, I guess. This sets a highly dangerous precedent. Without regulations, a country's physical state can be eroded or expanded, shifting the paradigm of territorial expansion. Instead of war or colonialism, land reclamation allows what is essentially the legal growth of a country's territory through terraforming. Singapore isn't appropriating land by conquering nations in order to become larger, it's creating it from the water by shrinking the land somewhere else. I mean, think about the ramifications of this. If you want more of a say in a local trade route, well, just expand your island out into the trade route enough that you have to make a new straight through, and that means other nations have to pay you a tax. Just push the land out far enough that you cover up a waterway. Now you have to be paid to make a door through. It might seem odd that such a small country is playing this monumental of a role in a global arms race for land, but when you consider its history, it kind of makes sense. In 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles, a British official who colonized Singapore, wrote that its potential as a hub for the East India Company was a, quote, fulcrum upon which empire shall thrive, and thus would begin Singapore's narrative. The island would primarily function as a place for global trade and shipping. To this day, the country proudly markets itself to visitors as the world's gateway to Asia. Before British contact, Singapore was mostly marshland. Its indigenous population made their livelihood by fishing the swamp for mudskippers. But in 1822, during Singapore's colonization, the country transformed from a fishing village to a port, which upended the natives' way of life and altered the environments by dredging mud from the marshes to lay the foundation for a harbor. Someone else might have been doing it, but it was Singapore's first land reclamation project. History has a way of repeating itself. but the notable difference is that the cost of Singapore's transformation today is the removal of its neighbor's land. The environmental degradation due to smuggling and its resulting sand war has strained ties between Singapore and the surrounding nations. But the most tragic component of the whole operation might be how Singapore's construction operates, through exploited foreign labor. The workers who are hired for the country's land reclamation projects are often Cambodians, Burmese, and Indonesians. Quote, the very same people whose communities live on or around disappearing islands and depleting marine life. These laborers are targets of predatory hiring practices, short-term jobs, low wages, and highly dangerous work. The tragic irony, of course, is that for every new Singaporean high-rise, these workers' homeland gets closer to extinction. The sand trade is systematic in the way that it financially benefits the importing countries, and the scale at which it operates is staggering. All evidence points to a future in which the illegal sand trade is here to stay, if for no other reason than the fact that the people who could stop it find it too important. Estimates of the sand war range, quote, from $200 billion to $350 billion per year, which is more than illegal logging, gold mining, and fishing combined. It's easy money for the sand mafia, as legal and illegal sand look exactly the same. This graph from 2017 shows that illegal sand extraction and trade had the third highest value of transnational crime based on dollars. It sits right behind counterfeiting and drug trafficking. Sand mining is dangerous and physically exhausting work. Most of these areas have already been exploited by previous mining operations, so divers have to plunge deeper into the riverbeds to extract the goods. On these riverbeds, sand is scooped into buckets which are pulled up by boatmen. And as a result, the risk of drowning is especially high. The danger of the job demands that sand miners often earn more than their average counterparts in their country, making it a valid career path despite the illegality. With a very low barrier to entry, some officials at the local level, for example, quote, turn a blind eye to small-scale mining, seeing it as a way of allowing poor villagers to build affordable housing. Due to the nature of their work, sand mining operators are usually armed. Rival sand mafias present their own threats, as well as those to the miners' livelihoods, which can come from local farmers and even journalists who might expose their work. More often than not, as the scale of small-time sand dredging increases, so does the likelihood for a sand mafia to emerge. It's the natural evolution of organized crime. We saw something similar happen in the world of illegal fishing off the coast of West Africa, when wildlife poaching drew criminal rings that eventually grew into illegal logging operations. If we use that framework for sand mining in Southeast Asia, the blueprint is already laid out. Weaker governments, easy entry to regional markets, and corrupt international corporations working together to create lucrative business opportunities. All of this is compounded by the reality that the demand for sand is unyielding. Singapore has remained particularly impervious to any legal action or punishment compared to the countries that sell its sand. In doing research for this video, it felt like most articles and media reports focused on the environmental and socio-economic effects of sand dredging in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Cambodia, but Singapore's response deserves scrutiny as well. In 2010, when Singapore's government was asked by Global Witness what its role was in the sand imports, the government said, quote, the import of sand to Singapore is done on a commercial basis. The Singapore government is not a party to any agreement or contract for the import of sand, essentially claiming plausible deniability by saying, hey, we've got nothing to do with it, and if it is happening, I haven't heard about it. However, this statement contradicts the discussions the government had in Parliament. When the need to stockpile construction materials was brought up so the country's domestic markets would hold stable should a shock occur to the supply chain or disrupted trade routes due to potential geopolitical tensions, one official said that the government would help contractors by, quote, co-sharing up to 75% of the price increases in sand and granite. This offer to share a portion of the cost with contractors directly disputes the Singaporean government's original statement of saying it doesn't purchase any sand itself. It's the government going from saying they're not buying any sand, it's all private businesses, to, well, we know sand's coming in, so we'll help you pay for it. Another contradiction was found by Global Witness when a government website showed tenders that were issued by the Housing and Development Board for the acquisition of sand for various development projects. In other words, more evidence of the government knowing of sand coming in despite saying otherwise. But the biggest contradiction to Singapore's claim that they have no involvement in the import of sand was discovered in a contract from JTC, the country's government agency under the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Global Witness says this contract was explicitly for the purchase of sand by JTC from an importing company. Global Witness even found that some of the sand dredging licenses from Cambodia had the stamp of a Singaporean official. Singapore then, it would seem, considers its government boards to be separate entities from the government. Or at least that might be how they justify their position. By employing multiple layers of contractors, Singapore is able to hide its own responsibility and role in the corruption of other Southeast Asian countries. Basically, I'm not doing the crime, I just have a guy that does the crime for me. But it's not me doing it, so I don't know about it. Allegedly, I guess. Can Singapore sue me? Probably. Yeah. Allegedly. It's a systematic loophole that keeps Singapore from legal recourse and liability. And despite the country's claims that appropriate policies are in place to ensure ethical sand mining, there's very little regulation in the regional and international legal context. In fact, an intergovernmental organization called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, promotes non-intervention in business relations among ASEAN states. In other words, the bodies that would regulate these kind of things are just gonna let the nations figure it out. I'm sure they'll both come to a reasonable conclusion. Very little is known regarding policies that outline the terms and conditions these states agree to when operating sand mining projects. The public must trust the word from Singapore's officials who, when asked, just maintain that sand mining from the country's neighbors is done sustainably. In 2021, when the Minister of National Development was asked if environmental studies about Singapore's sustainable mining practices could be made public, they responded that the studies, which guide the planning of land reclamation to mitigate environmental impact, were confidential due to, quote, overriding security considerations. That's right. When they were asked to show their work that they say is the reason they are able to sustainably mine for sand, they said, we can't show you that work because security concerns or something. Hey, is that the piece of paper that explains how this mining stuff is ethical and definitely not a bad thing? Oh, well, yes, it is. Can I see it? No. What the minister failed to mention was exactly what these standards were and what constitutes the overriding security considerations, as environmental standards are not publicly released. Singapore's biggest hypocrisy, however, is that it calls itself a, quote, leader in the region for sustainable development, despite the negative impacts the country's demand for sand has caused to its neighbors. Which, yes, I'm sure they are sustaining Singapore, and nothing else. Singapore's thirst for sand is now to the point where it looks beyond Southeast Asia. In addition to sand sources in the Philippines, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, it's reported to have set its sights on Australia and Papua New Guinea. Written accounts detail a, quote, Singaporean company was working to get approval to mine a 50-kilometer stretch of beach on the north coast of Madong. This stretch of coastline is a protected habitat for endangered leatherback sea turtles. Unless major government regulation is implemented, Papua New Guinea is destined to a similar fate to Indonesia and Cambodia. As legal, above-board sand mining operations look to expand globally, is it even possible to stop these sand mafias that follow? Only time will tell. But we're betting that the answer will be a resounding no. I mean, anytime someone wants to get something the legal way, someone is going to find a way to get it the illegal way. In recent years, Singapore has adjusted its sand importing strategies as a result of public criticism and scrutiny. The government announced plans to reduce dependence on imported sand and adopt a new reclamation method called impoldering. This involves, quote, building a dike around the area of the sea to be reclaimed, and then draining water from the area to create a patch of land that lies below sea level. Singapore also announced it would look into sand substitutes, such as recycled materials for construction. Ideas like floating cities, which are being tested in Japan, are also something Singapore is considering and building technologies for, but its development plans are still focused on land growth. Perhaps if legalities won't stop the sand trade, advancements in technology will. 3 years ago, according to the Scientific American, quote, researchers from several universities demonstrated an optical system that can fingerprint sand grains, allowing them to be traced back to their site of origin. This new technology would be used to help distinguish imported sand's origins from legal or illegal operations. This would at least make the illegal sand trade harder, as there would be a way to check it at customs. Other technologies include making desert sand usable for construction projects by putting an additive in it to make it stronger. While these announcements and technological advancements point towards a more sustainable future for Singapore sand demands, in 2024, Indonesia lifted its ban on sand exports and allowed sea sand dredging. The reason they dropped the rules after all this time? Money. Indonesian policymakers went back in the sand trade. Other countries looking to boost their GDP are likely to follow and lift their bans as well. As long as sand remains a foundational piece of Singapore's development, the incentive for smuggling also remains. The illegal sand trade and its accompanying sand mafia have already proven difficult to control. Profit margins, corruption, and uneven governance contribute to its thriving existence. This black market is driven by Singapore's need for sand and the rise of a multi-billion-dollar smuggling network. Adding in a lack of environmental oversight, Singapore is responsible for the shifting sands of coastlines, geopolitical tensions between its neighboring regions, a healthy criminal underground, and a trail of sunken islands in its wake. But it doesn't just end with Singapore. Not only is sand used for construction, but it is, quote, a key ingredient in the microprocessors and memory chips used in nearly all computer technology. Sand is the most wanted raw material on the planet, and Singapore's addiction is just a microcosm of a global issue. And while the United States has had a history of sand mining, there are more federal and state agencies that help regulate it compared to Southeast Asia, India, and Africa. The Sandman, a mythical character used in many children's stories who brings sleep-inducing sand and dreams, is now a nightmare. It's a reality that bears no allegiance to any nation. It's as borderless and liquid as money, shifting to the highest bidder. As we've seen with Malaysia, Indonesia, India, and Vietnam, there is no more land, only more sand. And that is the story of Singapore's and a lot of the world's sand mafias. Again, so much money being traded, so many lives being lost, and countries literally being reformed over something that most of us probably don't give a second glance to: sand. As with any other resource in the world, if someone wants something, then someone else is willing to sell it, legal or otherwise. But all in all, I believe this to be a fascinating, if lesser known, international smuggling trade that hopefully you found interesting as well. And if you did, I think that's really cool, and we just want to say thank you for watching. One of the most interesting aspects of this story to me were those initial journalists who broke this story in the first place. Like, it's one thing to sit here behind a camera and talk about what other people have figured out, but to be one of the first people who started to figure this out and then be like Sophie, the French documentarian who was captured and had all their footage deleted, but managed to recover it and then put the story out. Those people are heroes, and work like that certainly deserves to be remembered. No matter how dark the world can be, there's always lights like that that are worth shining through. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this topic. I certainly did. And everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description. Be sure to show them some appreciation. They did a fantastic job on this one. New videos here Mondays at noon. Videos, as always, going up on the OG channel, Wendigoon. And then videos going up like once or twice a week at this rate over on Wendiglitch. Check those out if you're interested. New content on the way, as always. And I believe that should do it for now. But before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! Even with the whole sand fingerprint system I talked about near the end, where they could determine if the sand came from a legal or illegal source, what would be the penalty for that? Like, if you catch someone with a cargo container full of illegal sand, is it like, okay, you're going to jail, or is there like a certain amount of parts per million illegal to legal sand you could have? How does that translate to my kid's sandbox? If I pour illegal sand, do I go to jail, or do we both get hit with a RICO case? I guess there's only one way to find out.